So whoever has joined, I thank you all for joining us this evening. I also thank Trishant for joining us. Trishant is a PhD scholar in political ecology and geography at the Cambridge University. His talk today is about wildlife conservation and social justice in India. Trishant, I hand over the session to you now.
Yeah, thanks, Sushil, for inviting me and asking me to speak on a topic that is not usually spoken much about, or rather is ignored, or the narrative is not very popular. So I'm glad that you asked me to speak about this. At the same time, it's kind of tricky and difficult because the topic that I'm going to speak about is actually a really complex topic, and to speak about it in a sort of non-academic way to an audience also that is not academic, and kind of probably hearing about these things for the first time is a very big challenge. So I'm not sure if I'll do full justice to it, but I'm going to try my best to explain these things. Um, so I'm maybe I just start my PowerPoint. So I'll just share my screen. Um, yeah. So my talks about wildlife conservation and social justice, and this is popularly in the social sciences and the humanities it is called as wildlife conservation's dark side, or the overlooked narrative. And sort of this discourse or this narrative has kind of really skyrocketed in the last 5 to 6 years, after multiple investigations by journalistic agencies came to light about how certain conservation organizations were actually involved in all kinds of human rights violations, and you know especially large conservation organizations having partnerships with international corporations that uh, are basically prime accusers, are the prime accused of kind of industrial level mining and industrial level oil exploration. So kind of a hypocritical position. So um, my talk basically will try and focus as much as possible on India, and also kind of give you a historic narrative to how wildlife conservation in India has evolved over the years, and questions about social justice that are very pertinent. And to be honest, in the last at least 2 or 3 years, a lot of Indian conservation biologists, historians, social scientists have been talking about this, and have been sort of engaging with this topic, which is actually a good trend. Um, Before we start with this, we whenever you talk about wildlife conservation or the history of conservation, or social justice, you have to go back to the sort of formation of the term national parks and of this idea of untouched, pristine wildernesses. And this kind of, I mean, the first national park in the world was in the United States of America, Yellowstone National Park. But the idea of wilderness comes from another landscape in the America itself called Yosemite, which is there on the screen right now. And this is the the term wilderness was first used as in the colonial period of when America, the United States of America, was colonized by the British. And they wrote about these landscapes of untouched beauty, large mountains, continuous forests, teeming with wildlife such as bison. And American explorers kind of romanticized that entire notion of it being untouched or pristine, but it really never was pristine. There were people that were living in these landscapes. Native Americans were living in this landscape. They were using its resources. They were hunting. They were hunting bison. They were trapping fox. They were trapping beavers for fur. Um, and there is this popular saying by a Native American leader called Luther Standing Bear, where he says that only to the white man was nature a wilderness. So this concept of pristine wilderness actually is a myth. It never really existed. There are no landscapes in the world other than sort of the north. I mean, not even the North Pole, other than probably the Antarctic, that have ever been pristine. There is enough evidence now that suggests that even the Amazon rainforests were secondary forests at one time, and large parts of it were actually grasslands. So sapiens as a species, human beings, have been shaping and adapting and managing these kind of landscapes for generations. And especially indigenous groups. Things have changed very rapidly now, and we'll come to that. But just trying to drive the point home about the concept of wilderness actually is actually a very problematic concept, because what it does is that it assumes that these landscapes were always pristine, and that any kind of human occupation of these landscapes is actually very bad for that landscape, or not good for the there's an assumption that it is not good for the ecology, not good for wildlife, and the popular notion is that the nature and humans cannot exist together, and that is what is kind of being challenged very heavily these days by a lot of sort of social scientists that critique wildlife conservation. So this concept of sort of pristine wildernesses has led to actually a lot of issues around the world in all these conservation landscapes. One of the most popular ones is the sort of Ngorongoro crater in Africa, in Tanzania, and the story goes around the sort of mass displacement of the Maasai community, the Maasai tribe, by again the colonial government that was in power, and it wasn't an eviction that was the kind of displacements that you get today, where you have sort of what's called voluntary resettlement, or there are sort of compensatory resettlement. At that time, it was just a violent eviction order that was given, and size might in it out, and then the sort of that entire landscape again as pristine and wild continued, and that all of us, like including me, we grew up sort of watching National Geographic and Discovery, looking at the Ngorongoro crater and the lions coming to drink water there, and tourism boomed, and this idea of it being completely pristine, that you could see it on camera, but what you didn't see was behind the camera, that there were Maasais that were grazing their cattle. It was a landscape that was shaped by 1,000-year history of pastoralism, and that changed overnight after the eviction of the Maasais. And this narrative is actually never told, and hardly people know about it. So even today, when people, tourists from India or abroad go to Ngorongoro, or to the Serengeti, they only see, the thousands and thousands of wildebeest. They see zebras, they see lions hunting, they see cheetahs chasing the Thompson's gazelles, but they don't see the Maasai. And they don't really realize what the problems the Maasais are currently facing in terms of no access to grazing land, completely because of climate change. Droughts are increasing, and basically their culture is going extinct. So that is a narrative that is ignored. Closer to home, in India, you've got similar narratives as well. Most of India's national parks were inhabited by Adivasis. There is a lot of work that is done on the Baiga community in Kanha National Park, which were overnight again displaced, and they have a very similar story like the Maasais. We'll come to the Baigas later when I talk about voluntary resettlement as well. But it's a narrative that hasn't been told. And it's the roots of this actually goes. I mean, now when I'm going to particularly talk about India at the moment. That the roots of this narrative particularly go back to the Imperial Forest Department, and the early years just before independence, between the 1900s to the late 1940s. There were three very popular Indian foresters. One of them was actually a governor of the United Provinces of India. The picture on the left is Sir Malcolm Haley, who was the governor of the United Provinces, and after whom was the So Jim Corbett National Park, as we know it today, it was named after Malcolm Haley because it was first called the Haley National Park. Then it became Jim Corbett much later. The second picture is the man himself, Edward James Corbett, and the third picture is FW Champion. There's a lot of again, when there's the time that we were basically reading up about Indian wildlife, growing up, we read books by Corbett, Jungle Lore and the Man-Eaters of Kumaun. And even today, the kind of romanticization that is done in the name of these, sort of on the name of these people, as they call it Jim Corbett as a hunter turned conservationist. A man whose heart was always in India. And if you read some of Corbett's work, like My India or Jungle Lore, you could see the kind of language that he uses in sort of talking about Indian people as well. Like, one could read it as a language of contempt against poor people, against Adivasis, against a sort of the language is very patronizing in certain sort of books that Corbett uses. And also, this framing of Jim Corbett as a conservationist, that helped sort of establish the Jim Corbett National Park. I find that lacks evidence and is kind of problematic, because Jim Corbett essentially was a hunter. Okay, now this is a very interesting analogy that the elites of India like to make, that hunters can become can have a change of heart and become conservationists, but Adivasis can never do so, because Adivasis do hunt as well. Local communities that live alongside these areas hunt as well. But coming back to Corbett, I did my entire PhD fieldwork in Corbett, in the region around Corbett, and one of the things that I found really fascinating was that how disconnected some of the forest villages are from this Corbett narrative. Some of them don't even know who Jim Corbett was. And there is a reason for that. And there's, the people, there are also some very good social scientists and historians that talk very positively about Corbett. And I see the merits of that, because Corbett essentially lived in this small town called as Choti Haldwani or Kaladhungi, very close to the national park. And while he was, when India got independence, he chose not to stay in India and he moved out. He went to Kenya after that. And Jim Corbett basically gave away all the property that he had, the property that basically the colonial government or the imperial government had allotted him, which was also land that was stolen. And he gave away all of that land. He distributed that land to the people of that village. Now, also, who were the people of that village? They were all upper caste Brahmins. And if you look at the Corbett landscape, most of the poverty or most of the marginalization that is there, especially in the forest villages, are 99% of the population of those villages are either scheduled tribes or scheduled castes. So there is a very big caste narrative here, and that is supported by a lot of historic work that is done on caste, that how the British always empowered the upper caste Brahmins to basically do their work, because in the Savarna order, the Brahmins had control over the rest of the caste. So this a lot of social scientists have kind of trying to sort of problematize this issue, and that is very necessary, because this romanticization of how we see these colonial agents is very problematic. And for example, after Haley National Park was formed, there is this notion that is said that Jim Corbett helped establish the national park. I've been trying, I've been going to the British Library, where there is a lot of archival material on this, and I have found very little evidence that suggests that Jim Corbett had. Yes, Jim Corbett did suggest that this part of the Terai should be part of, a national park or a game reserve for hunting, for when sort of royal families visited, but it never really was the intent to establish it as a that particular region where the national park is currently. In fact, a lot of Corbett's work, like Man-Eaters of Kumaun and the Man-Eating Leopard of Rudraprayag, the Temple Tiger and other man-eaters, it's all basically in the Kumaun Mountains. It is not in the plains, and the Jim Corbett National Park is in the plains. So that's very interesting. So when Haley National Park got formed and India got independence, just there was this wave of nationalism, patriotism that was going on, and the national park was renamed from Haley National Park to Ramganga National Park. And something very interesting happened just 5 years, 6 years later in 1955, that it got renamed to Jim Corbett National Park. And why did that happen? And it is very important to kind of relate that to the popularity of and the kind of international success that Corbett's books got around those times. Jim Corbett's books of especially Man-Eaters of Kumaun were international bestsellers. There was a lot of Western audience that was reading these books, and one could argue, or I particularly argue, that the naming of Jim Corbett National Park was a sort of a kind of a marketing strategy by the government of India to get more tourists to this region, especially catered to the Western audience. And if you speak to people around Jim Corbett National Park, they'll testify saying that earlier in the 70s, through the sort of 80s, 90s, most of the tourists that used to go to Jim Corbett National Park were white, were basically foreign audiences. And it's interesting that currently very few foreign tourists go to Corbett, and then that's a kind of a different discussion for another time. So what I'm trying to say is that the narrative of conservation that we see today is heavily shaped by the sort of the colonial agents that shaped this narrative, not just in India but globally. And the kind of the popular sort of notions of after independence was that we'll kick the colonial government out, and power will go back to the proletariat, will go back to ordinary people, and India will turn out to be prosperous. Wasn't true, and we can see that in other forms of economic and social systems of India today as well, and that is true of conservation as well. Throughout the sort of British period, also the kind of people that were interacting continuously with the British, sort of taking advantage of the colonial system because of their kind of privileges of either being blue blood or of being upper caste, were very evident to see. People that kind of shaped India's conservation in the initial period, especially the kind of very popular narratives of inviolate areas, completely pristine landscapes. You could read Billy Arjun Singh's books on Dudhwa, and how he talks about how the kind of thousands of swamp deer that he used to see in front of his house were being killed day by day by miscreants and by savage Adivasis and Tharus and and Adivasi communities that lived around his house. And later, sort of in more recent times, about the books, the sort of wildlife books that focused on the sort of behavior and habitat and sort of the biology of tigers. Walmik Thappar's books about how male tigers were also taking care of their cubs, and the entire sort of romanticization of this landscape about tiger bonds, and you'd had these BBC films of the Lady of the Lakes of Ranthambore. I mean, what these things did was they kind of limited the normal person's understanding of wildlife or of conservation, as very narrowed it down. I like to say that they kind of for example, Ranthambore was limited to like a Jurassic Park. You would only see it on television, that how you would only see 3 lakes, Rajbagh, Malik Talao, and Padam Talao, and Jogi Mahal, and you would see the author or the lead, a person of that documentary, sitting in the Jogi Mahal, sipping chai and watching tigers, and and you wouldn't see anything else. You wouldn't see the problems that the park faces, or the problems that the people of the park face, or people who lived in the park. For example, Fateh Singh Rathore is credited of relocating some 80 villages outside the national park. But that's it. After that, there is no narrative about what happened to those villages, what happened to those people, what kind of sort of marginalization did they face after that happened. All of this kind of gets buried into the sort of tourism narrative, where they say that so much tourism came, so people got employment. And if you but there is no evidence to suggest that. and even when people are getting kind of employment, you should see who are the people that are getting employment, where, what is the representation of indigenous peoples like Adivasis, or the representation of lower caste in this, in this narrative. So the post-independence conservation of history of India didn't really change much. Now comes the sort of, more recently, the sort of the best conservationist conundrum, and this I really like this graphic made by this international NGO called a Survival International, with whom I don't agree with in many sort of their readings. And one of this is that they say that Mowgli has been kicked out. His jungle is now a tiger reserve. They're talking about Kanha or Bandhavgarh, or one of the central Indian tiger reserves for sure. But tourists are welcome. And they say that tribal people from India's Kanha Tiger Reserve, home of the Jungle Book, have been illegally evicted in the name of conservation, but tribal peoples are the best conservationists. Now, till the time they say that have been illegally evicted in the name of conservation, yes, you can follow that argument. But at the same time, when you say that tribal peoples are the best conservationists, I find that argument also very problematic. There are no best conservationists. Conservation is a very heavy value-laden discipline. So, for example, what conservation is to me might not be what conservation is to Sushil. What conservation is to a Baiga tribal may not be what conservation is to Narendra Modi. So it is a very heavy value-laden field, and you can't have a certain conservation that is best or certain conservation that is ideal. Plus, there is a lot of evidence now that suggests that indigenous peoples, they, like, especially for example the Baiga community, the kind of global economic system that we live in does not allow anybody else in the world to remain in perfect harmony with nature. Obviously, local communities have a much less impact on nature than, say, for example, me sitting in this room with a laptop, with an Apple MacBook, with a screen that probably its electronic parts come from some mines in Central Africa. But so my impact is much more than, say, a Baigas or Chenchus or a Katkaris from Maharashtra. But sort of tagging something or some, sort of, again, this is also a certain kind of romanticization, saying that tribal peoples are the best conservationists. So that narrative is also problematic. And, and this is a problem when you see conservation as through a good-bad narrative lens. There is a lot of gray, and there's a lot of nuances, and there's a lot of complexities there that you need to understand. Coming to the sort of key aspect of when we talk about wildlife conservation and social justice is the issue of displacement, eviction, and relocation. Now, earlier, when India's tiger reserves were being formed in 1972, wildlife protection, right after Wildlife Protection Act and Project Tiger, a lot of evictions were actually done without any compensatory mechanism. So people were evicted out, sometimes even violently. Grazing rights. So, for example, one Gujar's grazing rights in the states of Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand were overnight, taken out, and there were no, and they faced a lot of restrictions. So, imagine, like, 1,000-year cultural system suddenly changes overnight, and that causes a lot of issues. Because anyway, these people are marginalized people in the social and economic order of the Indian cultural system. And then there is another driving force of conservation which sort of marginalizes them further. There's a very interesting book that is written by this guy called Mark Dowie, and it's called Conservation Refugees. So if you can get your hands on it at one point, do read, because it talks about the 100-year conflict between sort of the global conservation movement and of native peoples. And it talks also, basically, when they talk about conservation refugees. So, when we talk about refugees, we kind of relate it to either, refugees that are created because of a disaster, a natural disaster, or created because of a dam, or created because of a mine, or created because of, some other sort of an industrial system. But there are also, or a political violence, for example, the partition of India that created so many refugees. But it's so interesting, especially when I was starting out in the sort of, the humanities and the social sciences of wildlife conservation, that, the entire discipline also looks at conservation as a system that creates refugees. And that's something that really needs to be engaged with if the conservation movement or conservation needs to be has to become more and more sort of inclusive and more practical in the future. There is also another film that I would, very strongly recommend people to watch. It's called Daslakhiya, and it is. I think it will be available on YouTube. But if it is not, I can upload it on Dropbox and give it to Sushil later, and he can sort of forward that to you. But Daslakhiya, the film talks about, the recent compensatory package that the National Tiger Conservation Authority or Project Tiger gives for people to relocate outside a tiger reserve. So it gives 10 lakh rupees per adult member of a family. And what, and sort of the movie talks about how, when you give 10 lakh rupees, what is done of those 10 lakh rupees is the access to those 10 lakh rupees easy? How the amount of bureaucracy that is faced? We are talking about, Adivasi communities that in most cases are 90, very, very less literacy rates. The literacy rates are abysmal when it comes to Adivasis in India's forest. Their access to sort of their social capital is very limited. Their economic capital is very limited. So how the bureaucracy kind of marginalizes them further, even after they claim this package and talk about agree to being voluntarily relocated. It's a very interesting film on that, Daslakhiya. So you should watch it. And so when we talk about displacement, this is a common notion. Even today, when you are taking a safari in Tadoba and you see a village like Karwa, and you're like, oh, this should just be relocated outside. This process of relocation might seem very simple to an outsider who lives in an urban city like Pune, Bombay, Bangalore, or Delhi. But what you're essentially doing is kicking out somebody who's been for generations, that is staying on that land, has his cultural beliefs, his spiritual beliefs, his social beliefs entrenched in that and that system, and displacing them out because of this notion of that this is pristine, the area should be pristine, it should be devoid of people. And again, that's why I made the argument of this the colonial idea of wilderness and pristineness before, because it is the conservation as we know it today, the global conservation as we know it today, is a colonial idea of seeing humans and nature very, very separately. There's a lot of work on that is done on conservation-induced displacement within India, and they talk about the kind of impact that displacement creates. Once a relocation from a protected area is done, there are major themes that people have looked at. For example, the image on the bottom right here talks about food insecurity. There is large-scale unemployment. There is very little access. Because there is a system that they were living in before. Let me give you an example that I know from my own work of the One Gujjar community that was moved out of Rajaji National Park. This is a community that for thousands of years has been a pastoral community. Okay, so their understanding of there's nobody in that region that has a better understanding of pastoral systems and market access to that. What is the market around milk and ghee and and dairy, and basically dairy milk products. When One Gujjars were relocated outside Rajaji, they were given pattas of land in this place called Gendi Khata in Uttarakhand, and they were given land to do agriculture. They were given land to cultivate wheat. It is their access to markets, their entire understandings of the system was very, very challenging for them. So One Gujjar communities even today in Uttarakhand suffer a lot because of their access that is restricted to forests. So then, and plus all of this causes a lot of negative attitudes towards conservation itself. So one could argue that displacement and relocation does not really do you could see sort of kind of short-term benefits of how sort of ecology or populations of herbivores have increased in that area, but in long term this kind of creates even further and more complex problems. But there are also some good examples, because kind of painting this entire process of relocation as evil and not good, which a lot of social scientists like to do, that is also very problematic. There are good examples from this place in called Wayanad Wildlife Sanctuary, where the entire community agreed voluntarily to move out, and the process of relocation was very, very good. It was done very, very participatively. It was done, the decision making was good. The benefits were equally distributed. There's also a good example, in fact, from Maharashtra, from the Tadoba Andhari Tiger Reserve, this one village called Botezari, and there's a paper on that. So these are two papers that if you're interested, you could read on on voluntary resettlement, which is which are good examples of relocation. Yeah. So, but there is also questions need to be asked about how voluntary is voluntary. Okay. So, when there is a problem with conservationists, that they try to, when they talk about local communities, they talk about it as if they are, homogeneous structures. They're as if they're just one homogeneous unit. But within one community, you will have many different sort of social structures also, and economic structures also. So who gets to speak, who gets to decide, all of this needs to be taken into consideration. So when a process of relocation happens, you need expertise from anthropologists, you need expertise from social scientists that go in and help with the process of relocation, so that there is when the relocation process happens, that it is at least participative, and it is sort of the benefits are shared equally. And there's nobody that is not, so kind of nobody is left marginalized. That takes me to another very important aspect called as the Forest Rights Act, and the FRA has been in the news recently as well, because the Supreme Court of India, maybe several months before, decided that the people whose claims were filed and were rejected should now be evicted from India's forests. And that again was challenged, and there is a stay order on that now. But let me tell you a little bit about what the FRA is. So the Forest Rights Act was a bill that was introduced by the Congress government in 2006. It is also called as the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Act, or the Tribal Bill. When the Tribal Bill came out, it was, the idea was that, tribal communities in India and other traditional forest dwellers, they have faced, historical injustice, first by the British, and then by, modern day sort of conservationists and like post-independence elite conservation, as, not just conservation, but other people as well, that traditional forest dwellers have faced injustice, and they've not got their rights, and they've not got access to the same kind of social and economic systems that that most of other Indians have got. So the Forest Rights Act was introduced, and it was introduced. So why was there the need for the FRA? Was that the traditional forest dwellers were sort of occupying land across India. You will have villages that are called as Tongia Ngao, okay, or forest villages, where you would have forest dwellers, mostly Adivasis or people again from the scheduled caste, who were living there, but they did not have land titles. So technically they were illegal occupiers, or were often called as encroachers. So during my PhD fieldwork, I looked at 7 such villages, and I will talk more about that later towards the end of my talk. Their entire economic sort of system and livelihood revolved around non-timber forest produce collection. But that was also very heavily controlled by the state authorities and middlemen. So, the middle agents and contractors that would basically fleece them and, exploit them for the benefits, for their own benefits. Access to seasonal grazing was heavily restricted for them. And there was no kind of power, or they had no voice to kind of protect or manage their surroundings. There was and plus no role in the entire decision-making process that related to kind of diversion of these forests for other use, industrial use, or afforestation use, or for any other kind of forest use. So FRA, the need was that these are people that were historically kind of marginalized, and they faced historical injustice, and those wrongs need to be done right. So what does the FRA do? What it essentially does is that it grants two kinds of rights. One is individual rights, and the other is community forest rights. Individually, what it means is that one individual could, in one family, could basically claim up to a max of 4 hectares of land, which is currently under occupation by him on and before 13th December 2005. So anything after 13th December 2005 does not come under the purview of the FRA. It has to be before 13th December 2005. And that is a max of 4 hectares of land, and also currently under occupation. They can't just directly say that, oh, we were also there, so we'll go and get that land as well. No, it has to be land that is currently under occupation by them. The second kind of rights is the community forest rights, which is basically a right to manage, protect, and sustainably use community forest resource. So basically, a village could claim a patch of forest as a community forest. And this is very interesting because these are, there are provisions in the Community Forest Rights and the FRA Act that are even stronger than the Wildlife Protection Act. And let me come to that. So, under Section 2B of the FRA, it very clearly says that the duties of the CFR holders and a community forest rights are not given to individuals. They are given to a village. They are given to a Gram Sabha. So the main essential duty of the CFR holders is biodiversity conservation. Within the Act, there is a need for the community to form something called as a biodiversity committee, which becomes part of the Van Adhikar committee. There needs to be a management plan that needs to be incorporated with the working plan of the forest department, and also the FRA that the community forest that is established becomes a new forest category altogether. It is called as community forest. So like national park, like wildlife sanctuary, like biosphere reserve, you will also have something called as community forest. And also, and the most important part is that within the FRA, there's a provision of declaration of critical wildlife habitat. Now, what is a critical wildlife habitat? For example, you have a group of Adivasis that have claimed, rights under the FRA in, say, the core area of the Kanha Tiger Reserve. Now, under the FRA, it very clearly says that in expert opinion and in completely participative and consultative process with the community, the government and experts can help in the formation of a critical wildlife habitat where there is the Adivasis are resettled in a land of their choosing with complete participative processes and economically compensated for that in land also and money also, and that area can become a critical wildlife habitat. Now, once it gets identified as a critical wildlife habitat under the FRA, that land cannot be denotified. So at the moment, technically, even a tiger reserve can be denotified if the government deems so. If it thinks that it is of national interest, say tomorrow the government thinks that one part of the Corbett Tiger Reserve, we need to make an army camp over there because China can invade anytime. They can do it. They can denotify it. But under the critical wildlife habitat, if any area is called a critical wildlife habitat, it can never be denotified. So a lot of and that's what the state, the government, that's why is very afraid of this, because if that becomes notified as a CWH, a critical wildlife habitat, it becomes very difficult for them to sort of divert that land for any kind of industrial processes. So this entire conservation potential of the FRA has been undermined completely. Now, the biggest sort of resistance that the FRA has faced is not actually from the government. It is actually from hardline conservation. So when the FRA came in, I remember very clearly in 2006, 2007, all kinds of wildlife magazines, wherever we were, whatever popular, at that time, I think we didn't have Facebook, we had Orkut. No, maybe we had Facebook. It is all about, how bad the FRA is. All these sort of modern day hardline conservationists talking about how the FRA will be the death knell for Indian wildlife. It would be the death knell for deforestation. And there was, and recently, three conservation organizations in India, Wildlife First, which is based in Karnataka, Nature Conservation Society, not Nature Conservation Foundation. Okay, NCF is very, very different, and they are actually in complete support of the FRA. NCS, Nature Conservation Society, which is based in, I think, around Melghat, and TRACT, which is based in Tadova. These three organizations actually challenged the the FRA in the Supreme Court, and they told the Supreme Court that there have been many claims that have been rejected in the entire process of the FRA, and these claims that have been rejected, now the Supreme Court must give the order for the government to evict these people who are staying in forest land. The problem here is that these organizations fail to realize the completely abysmal rate at which the FRA is being implemented in India. So the government has taken, there is zero effort from the government of India to actually implement the FRA. It has been, there is actually an entire process that the government has to form something called as the Samaj Kalyan Vibhag. And the Samaj Kalyan Vibhag is to go to villages, all these forest villages, and is to do the prachar and do the propaganda of the FRA, and then help the people in filing the claims. But that has not been done at all. I mean, wherever it has been done, it has been very, very limited. And the process of filing the FRA is also not very easy. Okay, it is a complicated process, and it requires high literacy rates. It also requires some technical skills, because if they want to sort of get the CFR, the community forest rights, they need to do mapping of the area. They need to identify certain areas. They need to put it on a map. They need to form this committee and all of that. And we are talking about people that have very little economic and social capital. Most of them work as either daily wage laborers or completely off the land, by doing small scale subsistence hunting or by NTSP collection. They don't have the time to do all of this. So there have been lots of human rights groups and social organizations that have been helping them to do that. But a lot of this, so when all of these claims go, a lot of these claims get rejected because they have not been filed properly. Because the filing process is very important. If any of you have worked with sort of lower level government bureaucracy, you will understand how difficult it is to even go to an office and get one letter from them. And I was helping some of the villages in Corbett filing these claims, and it is a nightmare. It's a complete nightmare. So the claims that were rejected, if you look at the most affected, Madhya Pradesh, Karnataka, Odisha, these claims that were rejected, 90% of these claims were actually rejected because they were not filed properly. So very interestingly, what happened, and I found this very fascinating, that a lot of Indian conservationists, sort of modern day young conservationists, came together and supported the FRA and kind of wrote a letter, a joint letter against the anti-FRA case. And that also led to one of the largest conservation organizations, the wildlife conservation group called the Wildlife Trust of India, to withdraw its challenge of the FRA. So it's only these three organizations at the moment, Wildlife First, NCS, and TRACT, that that seem to have a very major problem with the FRA. Moving beyond the FRA, I mean, I could continue talking about the FRA, but there is a lot that I need to talk about, and it'll take me days just to talk about the FRA. So I will move on to another sort of contentious topic called as conservation militarization. Sushil, can you just remind me how much time we have left so that I can pace my talk accordingly?
We got around 20 more minutes for your talk. We can extend.
Okay.
It's not a problem at all.
Okay, thanks. In the last 5 years, actually even less, there is a new discourse that has come in the practice of conservation and in the sort of academic understanding of conservation, called conservation militarization. Now, the term conservation militarization is new, but the practice is very old. What conservation militarization essentially means is when conservation practices get militarized in nature. So basically, when you have military practices, for example, shoot at sight orders, the involvement of paramilitary forces in conservation sort of enforcement, the use of really high-tech surveillance technologies, tactics such as counterinsurgency tactics, such as ambush tactics, uh, you know, uh, military tactics. These all of these things overall in an umbrella term can be bridged as something called as conservation militarization. There are these two interesting papers that I've been part of that you could look at if you want a sort of deeper understanding of conservation militarization. So conservation militarization has existed in the past, but now in the last 5 years or 10 years, it has been intensified. For example, I've read many times over Valmik Thapar in the 10 years ago have been saying that if India needs to save its wildlife, India must involve paramilitary forces in conservation. If India needs to save its wildlife, tourism is the only silver bullet to it. I mean, there are a lot of these random things that are being that have been spoken by glamorous conservationists, but these things have very sort of strong social implications. And my PhD looks at these social implications and what are the social implications of militarization and military technology in particular. But conservation militarization, is not even as close as bad in India as it is in certain countries in Africa. So, in Africa, basically, you've got troops that are, either U.S. Army troops or British Army troops that have served in Afghanistan or Iraq or one of these, wars in the Middle East that go and train, sort of African rangers, like forest guards, in how to basically kill people, uh, how to do these kind of ambush tactics and things like that. And I don't think I should be stressing enough on what are the kind of impacts of militarization. We are seeing what the impacts of militarization in many parts of India. We see it in Chhattisgarh, we see it in Kashmir, we see it in Northeast India. Militarization causes a lot of problems, lots of human rights violations, human rights abuse. uh, there is very little social capital that people that have when they are under a militaristic regime. So now what does this mean in India's tiger reserve? So in India, as I said before, it is not even as close to as it is in certain countries in Africa, but we are seeing that trend shift. We have seen that a new force has been formed, especially for that sort of models itself with its militaristic beliefs, called a Special Tiger Protection Force. In Corbett, in the Corbett National Park, we've got something called as a Tiger Protection Force, which is basically all ex-army soldiers that have now stepped into the shoes of forest guard, and they're supposed to do what's called Shakti Pradarshan, show of strength in the villages, and that itself has a lot of sort of problems because these people are outsiders. They don't understand social systems there, and they come and sort of we can talk a little bit about that later, but they kind of impose their social values and social beliefs on the system that already exists. It causes problems for already the forest guards that are established there. But what we can see, particularly in India, in terms of the militarization, is in there are two national parks that are under the radar of being extremely militaristic in nature. One of them is Kaziranga National Park, and the other is the Manas Tiger Reserve. I worked for an extended period in Manas, and I know that it is really bad. And a lot of conservationists, give this argument that we need this militarization because these are these parks that have militants in them. Now, Manas Tiger, for example, Manas Tiger Reserve had seen a 10-year-long insurgency by the Bodo military, sort of the Bodoland movement that led to an insurgency there, and the militant group that was active there was called the Bodo Liberation Tigers. Now they have a ceasefire with the government. But there was another active group called the National Democratic Front of Bodoland, which is still active. Recently, they had some kind of a talk with the government, and there is a ceasefire there. But for a 10-year period, the entire region, there were militants in operating in the Manas Tiger Reserve. Now, there's a lot written on this, and there is an argument that says that Bodo militants shot rhinos and elephants. But the argument is that why did they shoot rhinos and elephants? The argument is that they shot rhinos and elephants to fund their campaign to continue that movement. what is interesting is that there is no evidence to suggest that they actually shot rhinos and elephants to fund their campaign. When I was in Manas, I did interviews with ex-insurgents and some also, insurgents. I mean, they're not current insurgents, but at that time had like either a chacha or a bhaiya or either a brother or somebody that was an active militant. And they spoke about something very interesting. They spoke about how the entire what I'm trying to tell you is that these things are extremely politically complex, socially, historically, and politically complex, and you need to understand these politically complexities if you are going to push for something such as conservation militarization. And that complexity was that the Assamese government historically has imposed its Assamese sort of systems, Assamese beliefs on the borderland region, and the Bodos didn't approve of that, of this language imposition, caste and class imposition, and the rhino was the symbol of that Assamese imposition. So if you look at, if you ever go to Assam, you will see the rhino as the flagship for most of its brands. You will see it as a brand. You will see it branded in Assam Oil. You will see it branded in the Assam hockey games, or everywhere you will have the rhino, 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 rhino. The Bodos looked at the rhino as a symbol of Assamese nationalism and shot rhinos as an act of resistance against the Assamese state. They didn't shoot rhinos because they were funding their campaign. Many of these ex-militants were telling me that at that time we didn't even know that rhino horn was, so popular in China. That it was, there was so much money that was involved that we could actually sell it and sort of fund our campaign with it. And also, when you are fighting a guerrilla war, when you are fighting a militant movement, a freedom struggle of sorts, you don't have time to go around shooting sort of shooting, yes, but you don't have the time to go around identifying buyers in all these areas. If you read critically around the literature around this, you will find out that that's a very false narrative that is peddled by some conservationists that say that Bodo militants shot rhinos because of because they funded their campaign by it. But because conservationists have the knack of jumping to things by oversimplifying certain things. So in India, it was the Bodo militants that because this is such a big problem, we need all this money so that we can arm our guards, and we need the paramilitary, and we need drones, and we need all these sort of money so that we can strengthen our system, so that we can fight this. So that's a narrative that you've got, and so that people can invest their money on. So, the best example for this narrative was there from I think this was 5 or 6 years ago, and we talk about this in our paper, of this organization called as the Elephant Action League and the African Wildlife Foundation, whereby some journalists said that an Al-Shabaab militant was found with one ivory, like one elephant tusk. And suddenly the entire African conservation world started talking about how Al-Shabaab was funding its entire campaign by ivory, when there was really no evidence to suggest so. But it's very important to know what it does. Militancy, terrorism, all of these are keywords. These are catchwords. Now, for example, an NGO's website will tell you, please give us $5 to save an elephant, because elephants are umbrella species and they are very useful in the ecology. That is one. At the other, they'll say, please give us $10 because killing elephants results in terrorism in Kenya, or results in sort of this Islamic terrorism. Al-Shabaab is an Islamic terrorist fundamentalist group, results in this, and suddenly there is a lot of money that is channeled. In fact, I mean, there was so much propaganda around it that it even in the U.S. Senate, Hillary Clinton is on record saying that we need to international wildlife crime is a very big issue, and we need to channelize our defense budget on tackling this important global issue. I am not saying that illegal wildlife trade is not an important issue. I'm saying that trivializing it, and by saying that it is funding terrorist groups here and there, doing that marketing around it, getting money for it, arming guards in remote African regions is very problematic, because it leads to problems. And those are the problems that I'll very quickly talk about. For example, this one case of this guy called as Guanboro Keeling. Those are his parents, very young guy, 19-year-old boy who had autism. He was autistic. He had he had some sort of a mental illness. He was grazing his cattle, and he strayed into the Kaziranga Tiger Reserve, and he was allegedly shot by the guards of Kaziranga. because they, they have a de facto shoot at sight. Actually, there is no shoot at sight policy, but they shot him, saying that he was a poacher that had come into the park to shoot rhinos, and this became a very big issue. Lots of human rights groups and social rights groups in that area took this matter up, and it became very popularized. You can also read about it. It was there all over in the newspapers. So the case of Gownsboro killing was, really took off the entire Kaziranga narrative to a new level. But hello, Vishal, can you hear me? Hello.
Yeah, you're audible, Trish.
Oh, sorry. Because there's a sound from my earphone. Now there is, a few months ago, BuzzFeed did an investigation on WWF's, dark side in some of the parks in Africa, especially in DRC and Congo, and they found out that WWF was giving money to armed guards that were basically raping, molesting, killing, maiming people in that area in the name of doing conservation. So and that became really, really problematic, because this is again the same thing, right? We are talking about and this is classic conservation militarization, where all this money is coming in to militarize your frontline forest guards, and then with that power, these people do abuses that that are extremely questionable. So and this is a very, very big issue in the conservation field today, and an issue that is not spoken about. If you're more interested, you should really read about this book called as Nature Crime and How We Are Getting Conservation Wrong, and the second book, which is there below it, called The Big Conservation Lie. And both these books sort of discuss these matters in details by giving very good case studies about it. During my work in Manas, I came across this poster, which is there below here. It's got the logo of the IFO and the Wildlife Trust of India on it. I will not talk much about it because it's there in the public platform. You can just Google Trishant Simlai, the Wire article, and it will show you how an organization, my narrative is that, they did a poster. And if you look very closely into the poster, you can see that that the poster has extremely violent and racist undertones. So look at the forest guards that are beating up shabby-looking, savage-looking people. They are, they're fair-skinned, and the people that are being beaten up are dark-skinned. Something like this. When I spoke about this at a conference in Oxford, there were people that were aghast about that how these narratives were still being peddled. So so there is what I'm talking about is that in non-governmental organizations, especially non-governmental conservation organizations, especially really big non-governmental organizations like WWF, the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, Wildlife Conservation Society. These are big organizations with plenty of money. We need to be asking questions about where this money is also coming from. Who is funding these organizations, and what is being done of these funds when it goes to arming frontline forest staff.
Now this leads me to another big problem when it comes to wildlife conservation and social justice, is this valorization and glorification of rangers. Now the term ranger was used very, again, it's a very oversimplified term. There's also something called as the Ranger Federation of the World or Ranger Federation of Asia or something, where they term rangers, all frontline forest staff come under the term of rangers. Now, I find that term extremely problematic because that completely ignores the power equations that are within that sort of umbrella term. For example, in the definition of rangers would be a range forest officer. In terms of India, would be a range forest officer, would be a forest guard, and would be what, I don't know why people don't talk about it, because they are the main forest force that India has. For every one forest guard in India, you have 10 forest watchers, fire watchers, laborers, and trackers. Okay, and this is a marginalized group within the forest department. I'll talk to you more about that why. So terming all these three positions under the term of ranger is extremely problematic because the power equations between a range forest officer, a forest guard, and a forest watcher are very different. A range forest officer is somebody with authority, has a lot of power. A forest guard is also a government employee. Okay, he gets his salary every month, has a pension plan. If he dies in the line of duty, has compensation. A forest watcher does not have a salary. He has what is called as a daily wage. Okay. Now you would be surprised by the, the kind of extreme exploitation that forest watchers, laborers, fire watchers, and trackers in India have to undergo in the name of, but at the same time they are valorized and glorified as, guardians of the wildlife and guardians of nature, but nobody is really talking about the kind of extreme problems that they live in. Even when people are talking about problems, people are talking about the problems of forest guards. People are not talking about the problems of forest watchers, laborers, and fire watchers. Now, say for example, in Corbett, one forest watcher gets a salary, which also that he doesn't receive every month, of 6,435 rupees, okay, per month, for a duty that is 24 hours. According to the law, he's supposed to work only 8 hours, but he's because his entire appointment is informal in nature. There is no formal appointment. It is, a forest guard goes to the village, say, oh, we need 4 people for like 1 year. Or the forest guard club, there is an entry that says that if you join right now as daily wage laborers, maybe in 5 years you'll become permanent. But I have come across forest watchers and laborers who have worked for 18 years, 20 years, and have still not become permanent. Okay, have been working on a salary, who started at salaries at 300 rupees per month, are now being paid 6,000 rupees, 6,435 whatever rupees per month. That too, they never get paid every month. They get paid once in 3 months, once in 4 months, and nobody is talking about this kind of exploitation within the forest. All of us, like so many conservation NGOs, they like to talk about guardians of the wildlife. We talk about arming them, giving them guns. We talk about giving them jackets. We talk about giving them caps. We talk about giving them shoes, and do a photo op with them, make some good films with them, talk about, there'll be all advertising and marketing around it. There'll be funding around it. But on the ground, a forest watcher is still struggling. Why is it that this is what came through my research when I was doing work in Corbett, that how is it that not a single conservation NGO over all these years, it is not that these conservation NGOs are blind to the problems of what forest watchers and fire watchers. They know what the forest department is doing. The forest department is basically illegally employing these guys, and it basically goes against all of India's labor laws. Okay, the kind of exploitation that is done of the forest laborers and watchers. They know very well what is happening, but their narrative never includes these people. And when it includes these people, they talk about giving them, solar water heater and solar cooker. Why is it that not a single conservation NGO has gone to the Supreme Court of India and challenged this systemic source of oppression? It is a very big question that, I don't understand how it has not been done so far. I will very quickly talk about, now I'm coming close towards the end of what I'm trying to say. My work, basically, that's the title of my PhD. I'm talking about conservation surveillance in Corbett. And, when I talk about conservation surveillance technologies, so there are many kinds of surveillance technologies in conservation, particularly camera traps, drones. In Corbett, you have something called as an electronic eye system. You've got this software called as M-Stripes mobile application. And that is very interesting because, I'm quickly going to skip through this part because this is just detailing my, my fieldwork, and I would like to discuss questions more. So, that's me doing field work, and these are basically forest watchers and guards that I'm speaking to below. Another thing that I keep discussing with Sushil as well is that as conservation enthusiasts or wildlife enthusiasts or wildlife tourists, we always see pretty pictures of elephants, tigers. We see problems of forest guards and how the forest department is so understaffed and all these problems, but we never see the problem of people that live alongside these tiger reserves. Now, when I was doing something called as an ethnography in Corbett Tiger Reserve, like I was entrenched, participated in sort of movements, protests. That's a form of social science methodology, and I was entrenched in that landscape for over a year. I understood the kind of resistance movements that are there against sort of this dominant urban, very sort of upper class and caste idea of conservation, where were people that were still did not have water, roads, basic things. They have the ability to vote in the national elections, in the Lok Sabha elections, but they don't have the ability to vote in their own village. They don't have the ability to establish a Gram Sabha. So, there are so many issues that are there, and these are pictures that you never see in the conservation narrative, but it is so important for these pictures to come out, because on the ground, conservation is about these informal relations with people that live alongside conservation areas. The costs of conservation are not borne by people that live in Pune, Bombay, Delhi. They are borne by people that live alongside these reserves. And if you do not have the support of these reserves, you're not going to be able to do conservation in an inclusive way. You will be able to do it with an iron hand, and that's only going to last for some time before, it's never, there is no evidence to suggest that it is actually successful. Now, I looked at the effect that this M-Stripes mobile application was having on the psychological well-being and the sort of, perceptions of forest watchers and guides. And I found that, I found very interesting things. And, I found a very big caste element that comes into how they perceive these technologies and how these technologies affect them. So, for example, for frontline forest staff like watchers and laborers, these are some of these quotes that from some of my interviews. And if you read the first one, it says that this is a strategy to keep an eye on us. There has been a rise in labor unions these days, and this way they can keep us in check and use disciplinary power on us. So what this watcher is particularly talking about is that what this app does is that before you go for your patrol every day, the guard and the watcher and his 3 watchers have to sort of patrol the beats that they're assigned to. Now, before they go on the patrol, they're supposed to take a picture of themselves and start, this application on their phone, which basically monitors their movement across. So they already have a GPS, but this kind of records all of that and in sort of real time uploads that information into the M-Stripes platform, which is monitored by the Wildlife Institute of India. They also have to upload it in the range forest offices. But, I'm looking at it from the perspective of the forest watcher. The forest watcher says that this has intensified his work. Anyway, he's working 24 hours a day. He's unpaid. He's a daily wage laborer. And plus now there's this app that has been imposed on them to monitor that too. So they're looking at the surveillance from a very, very negative perspective. I'm giving you a very kind of simplistic understanding of that because we don't have enough time and I would like to take questions. But what happens is that surveillance technologies themselves, you would never expect what a camera trap or a drone would do to people. There are what I'm trying to say is that these technologies have social implications. Camera traps are used in areas that, you also get people in those camera traps. But what are those people actually thinking about it? These days, privacy is a very big thing. Now, if you are living in your house and there's somebody who puts camera traps in your garden, you will not be very friendly towards that. Or somebody, will fly a drone over your house around your window, you will probably be very, you'll have very negative perceptions of that. So why is that it is completely acceptable to do that in areas, in villages that are next to tiger reserves in the name of conservation? So that is my main argument. One of the biggest things that kind of, which is going to become an entire chapter of my PhD, it looks at the sort of gendered experiences of surveillance. I found that women look at surveillance very, very differently than men. So, and the reason for that, insofar in Uttarakhand, it is an extremely patriarchal and conservative society. Women are the ones that go to the forest to collect grass and firewood, and they go every day. Now, many, a lot of people argue that, oh, now there is LPG. Why do women still go? They shouldn't be going. It is because, again, this is a very typical, conservationist oversimplification of things, because he's looking at it from a very binary perspective. The conservationist is thinking that the woman is going inside the forest to collect firewood and to collect grass. He's not looking at the social system that actually pushes the woman to go inside the forest. Now, let me tell you what the social system is. Women in Uttarakhand or Pahadi society, and I'm sure in many other parts of India, go to the forest not because, that it is a necessity, like obviously it's a necessity, firewood and grass is important, but they also go because that is the only liberated space that they have. In the village, they cannot talk about each other's husband, each other's sexual lives, each other's, sort of personal lives, gossip about each other's, mother-in-laws. That space is provided to them in the forest. The forest is a space of liberation. It is a space of freedom for women. And that space of freedom is now infringed by camera traps. Now, so, women look at camera traps very, very differently than men. Also, the experiences of women, the sort of the implications of the camera trap image so for example, there was this woman who was talking to me about, her image that was captured in a camera trap, and the forest guards and the watchers of that area, they took the picture, and the image was, I mean, she was in a very compromising position, so she was relieving herself, and she didn't realize that there was a camera trap behind her, and it caught, the camera trap basically caught the act of relieving herself, and that picture was circulated in the sort of what now everybody has smartphones, and was circulated in the WhatsApp groups within the village. So you can't imagine the kind of shame and social ostracization that can cause to an individual when something like that happens. So these are the kind of implications that surveillance technologies can have. So again, these are various quotes from my work with women and camera traps. So for example, if you look at this one that says one woman's picture of relieving herself was caught, and instead of deleting, they circulated it in their phones, and that is such a problematic thing. It's actually illegal, that amounts to sexual harassment. Then something like what are they trying to monitor by flying a drone where women from our village go to relieve themselves? Can they dare to do the same in the upper caste villages? I noticed that in Cobbett, the drone team was only flying the drone in the forest villages, or they would fly. So according to the DGCA regulations, you are not allowed to fly a drone above human habitation. But the forest department was flying the drone above the forest villages or sort of encroached village land, but they were not doing the same in the revenue villages, which is basically dominant landed elite, so mostly upper caste people, because the kind of social capital that they have. If they do it in a village where I was staying, for example, I stayed in this village called Kyari, if they would ever have flown a drone above somebody's house over there, the entire drone team would have been beaten up and their vehicle burnt. But something like that is very easy for them to do in a village that is marginalized anyway. So I was trying to sort of unpack these kind of power equations that exist on the ground. So when I talk about these surveillance technology, I talk about these implications. Many people are wonder that why their camera traps get stolen or why their camera traps get damaged. A lot of wildlife biologists have a very simplistic understanding about this, that they think that they're just doing it because they're stealing it, or because they are doing something illegal. Now that I have found through my research that is again a very simplistic narrative. There are many motivations for people to actually destroy camera traps or remove camera traps, and one of them is this fear of being harassed, being exploited, and also that they look at the technology as as an object of state surveillance, and that is the resistance that is coming to them from them is actually, for example, in one part of this area, when I'm talking about this Cobbett, that particular quote that I was talking about, when the image of that woman was circulated in WhatsApp groups. So nothing like this stays private, right? These villages are very well connected, so the news spread to other villages. So one of the villages, they decided to go and destroy and remove all the camera traps that were set around their vicinity, and that event didn't even happen in that village, but because of that, it triggered these guys to do that. So these things are extremely complex, and these things need to be engaged with. So when we talk about social justice and conservation, what is the way ahead? One for when people ask me was, if you have so many issues with conservation, why are you in conservation? What are your recommendations? What do you think should be done? One of the first, and I don't have a straightforward answer to that, and I think the first thing that we need to realize is that conservation does not exist outside this. It doesn't exist in a bubble. It exists within the sort of global social and economic systems, and it is driven by these social and economic systems. So one could argue that conservation is driven by the neoliberal nature of the economy that is happening around the world. It is driven by fundamentalism. It is driven by casteism, all kinds of social systems. And one of the first things that when we are talking about inclusive and socially just conservation is that we need to first accept this fact. We need to first accept that conservation has had a very dark history. It has been the entire narrative and its implementation till now has largely been defined by elites. For example, we talk about sort of representation of Adivasis and Dalits in India's political systems or India's bureaucracy or India's other kind of economic system. We never talk about those representation within conservation. Conservation has been very upper class and very upper caste. And why is it that why am I saying that this is important is because being upper caste, being upper class, we come with certain notions, we come with certain cultural and social privileges and economic privileges that blind us to the kind of injustices that are there on the ground that are felt by marginalized groups. And for that, to overcome that, the first thing is that we need to accept that one, conservation has had a very dark history, and second, that conservation does not exist outside the purview of global and economic and social systems, and we need to kind of navigate those global and economic social systems and work in conservation in tandem with those systems, and also realize that these problems are very complex. There are no short fixes or silver bullets. Many a times what happens is that we take this act now and think later approach. It is important to take these things slowly. It is important to give it good thinking, and to be honest, I'm actually very glad that how conservation in India also is progressing these days. And there's a lot of discussion nowadays on on sort of social inclusiveness and human rights and socially just conservation and inclusive conservation. But it wasn't there 2 or 3 years before. But still, it is not enough, and we need to be sort of this fortress sort of conservation that we have created of the ruling elites and people with privileges, that needs to be sort of broken down, and we need people from different backgrounds, different sort of communities that dictate sort of conservation practices and advocate conservation. Yeah, so I think I'm done and I can take questions. Sushil?
Thank you, Trish, for this amazing talk. In case anybody has any questions, yes, Pranav has raised his hand. Pranav, please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, hi, Pranav.
Thanks, Trishan. That was really interesting presentation, and a lot of my fieldwork also overlaps with yours.
Mhm.
So I'm currently doing my fieldwork on the Van Gujar community in the context of setting up FRA claims for them.
Oh, perfect.
But my entire thesis also rotates in the context of the wildlife first case, which I've been involved in. I'm a lawyer by profession, but right now I'm doing my MPhil at JNU.
Okay.
So in that regard, I had 3-4 questions where I thought some of the aspects which could be integrated with some of what you spoke about.
Mhm.
One was the discourse around critical wildlife habitat, because right now in Maharashtra, CWH is being misused by conservationists to propagate a narrow notion of what wildlife CWH is to be defined.
Okay.
So although Section 4.2 of the FRA speaks about greater requirements such as resettlement plan and prior informed consent, and explore the possibility of coexistence with the wild.
Right.
But that's not how conservationists have been looking at this discourse. So maybe if you could throw some light on that. That was my first question.
Okay.
Second question was, I wanted to also highlight on how you mentioned about this discourse on conservation and militarization, but in India, how the compensatory afforestation discourse also is going on, that also facilitates this narrative. And somewhere, some of my research is on this area where REDD+ and CAMPA and such mechanisms, on the ground of increasing additionality or forest cover for climate change obligations, you are trying to increase the buffer area of these national parks. So for instance, right now for Rajaji itself, there is a plan to increase the buffer zone, and that is the recent push for eviction with regard to the Van Gujar. So that was my second question about whether you can link this militarization to how aggressive the compensatory afforestation discourse in the state is also going.
Okay.
While there is no frowning upon with regard to how diversion of forest is happening.
Okay. So
and my third point was specifically in the context of the Van Gujars. The fact that the courts also, and even be it the wildlife first case where the kind of evidence which is submitted by these conservationists are on satellite imagery and such imagery to discard their claims or discard the fact that rejections are happening. There's a clear trend which is identified that other traditional forest dwellers under the Forest Rights Act are not getting most of the claims because they have 75 years evidence proof. They have to prove their evidence for 3 generations. So the documents and all of this is becoming a problem. So in that regard, and similarly in Uttarakhand also, how the Van Gujars are currently enframed by the courts there as poachers, and on the guise of being evicted. So in that context,
Right.
despite there being a judge who's saying that rights of nature is applicable in that ecosystem
Yeah.
where Corbett and Corbett and Rajaji exist, but still you have that same sort of logic which is pervading, like the colonial understanding.
So
Yeah, that's
yeah, right. I mean, your third point was more of a comment rather than a question, if I'm not wrong, and I completely agree with you, Pranav. And so the first thing about critical wildlife habitat, I again very strongly agree with you that a lot of conservationists have been peddling this narrative, and that is kind of blinding. See, the problem is, Pranav, I think that even with from being me as a person being on both sides of this issue, where I'm a trained conservation biologist and then sort of moved into the sort of social sciences of conservation and sort of this anti-elitist conservation narrative, and having interacted with so many FRA activists as well, I think that there is a lot of miscommunication that happens between these two groups. A lot of conservationists who've kind of have sort of started championing the case of FRA also miss these small nuances that are there. So I mean, I agree totally with you that the critical wildlife habitat is also that section is of the act is also being misused by conservationists, and I can see how on the ground that can it's very easy to talk about it being participative and the decision making being very participative and an equal participatory process, but on the ground with when there are conservationists that are being the sort of people who are organizing the baithaks, who are organizing the committee meetings, it can go the other way. So I agree with you on the first point of the CWH being misused by conservationists. Your second point on Campa and conservation militarization, I haven't looked at it that way, but thanks for pointing it out to me. But for example, so when the narrative around conservation militarization really heavily revolves around military techniques being used in conservation practice, and till at the moment, in my understanding, it has been limited to sort of Project Tiger reserves. In that sort of territorial forest divisions where Campa funds are coming and compensatory afforestation is being done, you are actually right. Actually, I mean, now that you talk about it, it's striking to me, and I hadn't looked at it that way, that drones were being used in certain territorial forest divisions of Uttarakhand to identify areas for Campa funds to be allotted and the forest to be looked at. So yes, I think there could be you could make that relation, but most of the literature and work around conservation militarization is still very limited to sort of wildlife conservation as such. So protecting sort of charismatic species by militaristic means, and also conservation militarization in areas that have other kinds of sort of political problems, armed conflict specifically. So in Chhattisgarh, in some parts of Maharashtra like Gadchiroli, and Northeast India, Manas, Kaziranga, a lot of the other northeastern states as well, like Manipur, Mizoram, are also very heavily militarized. Arunachal Pradesh, Pake Tiger Reserve is extremely heavily militarized. So most of the conservation literature, militarization literature at the moment is revolving around that. And to be honest, thanks for pointing me, towards that direction, and I'll have a think about it. And yeah, it's nice to make your acquaintance. I think we'll have plenty to talk about at some point later.
Amod, you can go ahead and ask a question now, please.
Hey, Trishant. That was a spectacular talk, man. Nice to look at the history of all of this. These are often subjects that people don't talk about. I have a couple of questions. One is with M-Stripes. I would like to know a little bit more about why people are kind of against the idea, because most of corporate world, even here in my Minnesota University, when I'm teaching, I need to kind of put in my time in and show that I have done work. So I'm kind of interested in knowing why people are really against it, because at some point, for everyone who is doing a sort of a job, I completely agree with the fact that watchers and trackers need to be paid more, need to be given all the security that other people do. That's I am completely on board with that. It's really disgusting that people don't get those securities and benefits that the government and the forest department owes them.
Mhm.
But I remember that few years ago, when maybe 10 years ago, when they introduced the biometric system for people in government offices,
Mhm.
there was a big hue and cry about why we need to do this,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So why is it that, as in, do you see that as a problem of people not wanting to really put in their time, or they are just worried?
Mhm. Okay.
So that's kind of my one question. Second question was about the Bodo poaching in
Mhm.
thing. So you said that it was not for money, right? Rhinos were being killed as
Ye-
a
Yeah, I think I said it was not to fund their campaign.
correct. Yeah. So
Yeah.
it was not for money, right?
Yeah.
It was not to gain money.
Mhm.
Uh, Rhinos were being killed nonetheless, right? Whatever
Yeah.
the system.
Yeah.
So in that situation,
Mhm.
given that it is an insurgency,
Mhm.
what according to you would have been a way to manage it? Of course, talking to people and ceasefire and all is uh,
Mhm.
a, a, a way forward talk.
Mhm.
But during that critical period for 10 years, when, as in, I don't know if you know, but we almost got abducted by Bodo, right?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
so
Arunachal.
I see the problem, and I've seen people coming with guns.
Mhm.
So I was just wondering, for that 10-year period,
Mhm.
where as a symbol of resistance, when
Mhm.
rhinos were being killed, what potentially could have been a solution during that time?
Okay, so I'll take your second question first about see, Modi, this is a topic that is extremely complex and political, and when you talk about solutions, so the issue was not the rhinos that were being killed obviously was problematic for for conservationists, but what I was stressing on was that the rhinos that were being killed and the narrative that was being peddled by by conservationists to sort of get funding and to militarize was problematic. Okay, because they were not engaging with the solutions. Conservationists cannot have solutions to this kind of political problems, because if you go to the sort of the politics of the Bodoland movement, you have to start all the way with the entire imagined Upper Assam as Bodoland. It was, I mean, forget the rhinos, the Bodos for the settlement of their rights, they went, and I mean, you and me have seen Sonai Rupai Wildlife Sanctuary, and that sanctuary doesn't exist anymore because Bodos have gone on and chopped off the entire forest over there, because they were asserting their rights onto that land. So I don't know what the solution of that could be. I think the solution for that is not a topic for conservationists. It is
Can I
this is
jump in just for a second? I'll just
yeah,
clarify my
yeah.
question.
Mm-hmm.
I understand your point. As in,
Mm-hmm.
it's a bigger problem, but
Mm-hmm.
sometimes don't you think that as in the bigger problem, and you need to go to the root, and doing militarization and tracking is more like treating the symptom rather than the root cause of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
I can understand that,
Mm-hmm.
but at some point, do you think that having short-term militarization has value? Let me put it that way.
That's a good question, and see, there is very little evidence to suggest that it works. Okay, so you have to look at what short-term militaristic sort of techniques or solutions. What are the implications of that? So if that kind of militarization is causing very heavy social implications like human rights violations, because any kind of intervention is not going to be it obviously will have social and political implications. So you have to look at it from you'll have to look at it from a perspective that you have to sort of try and measure that, like what is the effectiveness of that militarization? Is that militarization helping? Did the militarization of the board of Manas forest guards help in the complete decimation of the rhino population in Manas? It did not. Is the militarization in Kaziranga really helping? Rhinos are still getting poached, and I mean, over the COVID crisis, sort of the poaching has increased. So the main argument that sort of the critique of conservation militarization has also for conservationists is that these short-term militaristic measures don't work. There is not enough evidence to suggest that it works. So that would be my response. Modu, your second question, you're absolutely right, and this is a good point that you've made. And there is now a lot of literature on workplace surveillance, and how And this is again it's because my work comes from sort of my theoretical framework comes from a very Marxist perspective of global capitalism and labor relations. I would I would say that these are extremely problematic things, like I mean, I find Aadhaar very problematic. That could be something that you could relate to the sort of ideological perspectives, and there could be an argument for that. But let me particularly talk about M-Stripes, because otherwise that's for a long discussion. M-Stripes, particularly the forest watchers, not just the watchers, even the guards find problematic. But I'll particularly talk about forest watchers is because they would be very accepting of the M-Stripes software. Like for example, guards. Some of the guards, they really like the M-Stripes software because they can visualize, what they have done and what they have not. The watchers, find it problematic because the app is now making them do certain things which they wouldn't have if the app wasn't there. Now, as a conservationist, we would argue it is forcing them to do their jobs. But the problem is that the job, they're not, the circumstances, the institutional circumstances that revolve around their job are actually already very, burdening for them. As I said, and as you agreed, that the kind of institutional support that they have is very minimal. They don't get paid on time, and on top of that, when they are being surveilled for the kind of work that they do, they have like very negative perception towards the app. Now, one more thing, let me point out to a more sort of practical issue with M-Stripes is that it is a phone, and you have to keep on feeding information in that phone. So if you find a tiger's cat, you put in that information. You find cheetal droppings, you put in that information. Now, we all know, because we've all done transects in the forest and all. In Corbett specifically, Corbett at the moment has the highest density of tigers in the world. There are lots of elephants. In the recent past, there have been 4 forest watchers who have died, by tiger attacks. All out of those 4, 3 of them were feeding in information when the attack happened. So a lot of the forest watchers think that because of the complexity of the app, the sort of interface, it is distracting them from while they're doing patrolling. So that is a much more of a practical problem than than a sort of more ideological or a more theoretical one. So so that my answer to that would be that that M-Stripes can be problematic from the ground perspective because of these things. Also, you need to I mean, another argument that I would give is that you need to realize the kind of power or the sort of privileges that you and me have is very different from if we are being surveilled, we have access to the kind of resources that would lead us out of a situation, a tricky situation, if that power is misused on us. But there are groups and communities that are surveilled through a whole range of surveillance mechanisms that will be exploited and harassed because they don't have social and economic capital to overcome that. So, so that would be my answer.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Okay, there are a few more messages in the chat box, but they're more on the lines of comments than questions. Pranav writes again about short-term militarization in Chhattisgarh has worked backwards. Naxal offense category, all colonial modes of
securitizing. Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with you, Pranav. It's almost as if that we are reading the same literature. And I agree that, short-term militarization actually works backwards. I mean, even in Kaziranga, when the Indian government, initially the poachers used to come with handmade guns, like the local kattas and .303 rifles. As soon as the the home guards of Kaziranga started coming with automatic weapons, now there have been also the Karbi militant group that sometimes is known to come and shoot rhinos have started coming with automatic rifles. And this has been seen in Africa as well, that militarization, and this is a point that I missed, militarization of conservation can trigger an arms race in that area. And that can be very, very problematic. So the more and more you militarize, you will get resistance unless and until you don't sort of target the root causes of the issue. And the problem is not that, the root cause is sort of not being spoken about. I'm just saying that all of these issues are, like, for example, the short-term fixes are accelerated while long-term issues take, a backseat when we talk about conservation interventions.
Again, I think we can take 1 or 2 more questions. In case anybody has any more questions, please either raise your hand or you can type the question in the chat box.
I think Pranav has another question, looks like.
Yeah, he raised his hand and yes, please, Pranav, please go ahead and ask your question.
Um, So I think I stressed on this a little before also, but what do you know of how any of these conservationist agencies, because of their over reliance on technological means,
Mm-hmm.
like what other counter strategies can FRA activists or group involved doing
Sorry,
what
Pranav, I've completely lost you there. I can't hear you at all.
can do?
Pranav, your voice is
So,
not audible. If you could type your
for
question, please.
instance, some of the things which presently is affecting the Van Gujars is you mentioned about one second. Hello.
Yeah, better.
Yeah, you're better now. You're audible now. Yeah.
Hi, Pranav, can you hear us?
Hello. Am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, you're audible
Yeah.
now.
So my question was linked to this concept of something which I spoke about earlier, like how conservationists are relying on a lot of technological tools to show that this area is encroached or this area is not encroached.
Mm-hmm.
So, as researchers, what can we do to counter such forms? So, one of the strategies which we are thinking, I'm associated with Center for Pastoralism. So,
Mm-hmm.
one of the strategies which we are thinking to make sure or the community has this access claim over the Rajaji landscape
Mm-hmm.
is to do mapping.
Mm-hmm.
But uh, one of the problems which we are facing is that how the discourse of this buffer area and core area, the fact that even the climate change this logic is focused on increasing vegetation and forest cover in buffer zones, and that is done at the cost of increasing tourism, like what you mentioned, Trishant, but
Mm-hmm.
eviction of forest dwellers in this regard. And
Mm-hmm.
this framing of the Van Gujars as poachers has become a very severe issue. And recently, during the lockdown, there have been 2-3 instances of eviction which has been done.
Yeah.
There is a process of an NRC, like the fact that you are counting the number of forest dwellers because they weren't allowed to migrate this time as well.
Yeah.
And in a way, uh, somewhere you are, although the Gujars from Himachal and JNK, they possess ST status, but in Uttarakhand they are under OTFD category. So they, because they fall under OBC. So during this Corona time, there was also this narrative around Corona jihad from because
Yeah.
one of them was with the Tablighi Jamaat issue.
Mm-hmm.
So all of this tied up somewhere. Don't you think this discourse around eviction and forest dwellers also is linked to the citizenship issue somewhere, which is brewing in India in the context of forest dwellers and documents?
I think there were two questions in there, Pranav. One was about technology, right? So about the first issue with technology, I just gave this link to you, and I think you should check it out. It's on counter mapping. And this is something that we are trying to do around Corbett by using the same technology that the state uses to identify buffer areas or whatever, and we are trying to give that power to communities to do the mapping for their FRA claims. So this is an entire different venue of research. So how technology can be used to do counter mapping, and I think that you would find that very interesting for your work with Van Gujars. So like as you must have very clearly, the technology is power. It's a very power laden thing. All kinds of technologies are, and that when used from a counter perspective can it can be an interesting avenue for work and looking at especially if you want to do some mapping in that area. So you should check that out. Second, about the NRC issue, I have come across it very, very clearly. So even in Corbett, just after the NRC was passed in the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, there was a encroachment drive that the Corbett Forest Department undertook, and it very, very clearly I mean, I know of the, I interviewed all of the One Gujars in that area, and I remember very clearly that the forest guards and the range forest officers, and including the divisional forest officer at that time, were very clearly making very open, suggestive remarks of One Gujars belonging to the certain community that they're Muslims. One of them even went to the extent of saying that one old One Gujar lady, in her 80s, came running to the officer and said कि ये आप क्यों तोड़ रहे हो, हम कहाँ जाएंगे? The reply was, go to Pakistan. So I can totally connect those two, and I see that happening a lot, and I'm sure One Gujars will be at the receiving end of this because they belong to a certain community. So yeah, I agree with you too again, Pranav.
Thanks. Like, just wanted to clarify whether that linkage was not made in isolation, because a lot of people often tend to not look at citizenship and issues of
Yeah,
forest dwellers.
no, I don't think it is in isolation at all.
Yeah, thanks, Trishant. Like,
Okay, I think we have taken all the questions that have come up. In case anybody has any more questions or wants to connect with Trishant, he is available on social media. You can DM him so that he can send you his email ID. Or Trishant, if you could write your email ID here in the chat box, people could send you emails to connect with you in future.
Yeah.
Okay, people, this email ID is in the chat box. The two of them, you can copy them. Thank you, Trishant. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sushil, for inviting me.
I also thank everybody who participated and attended this session. I and Journeys were particularly keen on this talk today, mainly because the more we at Journeys are getting involved with policy making, with outreach programs, we are realizing the discourse in the management everywhere when it comes to conservation, because conservation policies are the implementation of these policies are handled at a very, very superficial, shallow level. Nobody is actually connecting the dots and trying to understand whether the policy is working out or is it not, and how it has been implemented. And whatever little work we have done till now is exactly on the lines of what you spoke of today. In fact, we have been told a lot of times to do our outreach programs a certain way, because you do not want to piss off the senior conservationists, the armchair conservationists, or the department as such. And this talk was very, very crucial, and that is why we are very, very glad that it happened today. Thank you for this talk. In case people who joined this session late, do not worry. This talk will be on a YouTube channel. The channel name is Journeys Explore. So in case you have missed out on this talk, we will be uploading this talk in the next 1 hour on YouTube as well. Feel free to share this talk so that a lot more people get to know about this topic. Because like I said, conservation is a very, very vague term in India right now. And most people do not understand the insights of it, especially the side presented by Trishant today. So please share this video as much as you can. Our next talk will be on Sunday. It is about the evolution of wildlife photography over the past 3 decades by Rahul Sachdev. And once again, I thank Trishant for this talk. Thank you, Trish.
Thank you, Sushil, so much.
Thank you guys for joining us.